Before sunrise at a quiet elephant sanctuary in the Utah desert, a white baby elephant rang the emergency bell outside Walt's cabin. She was covered in red mud, shaking, exhausted, and desperate for water. But when they offered it to her, she pushed the bucket away. No one understood why a baby elephant would come to humans for help until she led them toward an old abandoned mine. Deep beneath the ground, something was dying in the dark, and she had not come to save herself. The desert had not fully woken yet. A thin blue darkness still rested over Cedar Ridge Elephant Haven, softening the red cliffs and quiet fences. Far out beyond the sleeping barns, a small white calf stood alone in the cold dust, listening to the last drops of storm water fall from the metal roof of the night station. Opal should have been asleep beside the warm bulk of Grace, tucked inside the old elephant barn where the hay smelled sweet and the walls blocked the wind. But her pale skin was streaked with red mud, and her ears trembled with a fear too urgent for crying. Something had happened in the dark, something too large for her little body to carry. She moved toward the wooden cabin where Walt Bennett slept behind a screen door and a porch light that flickered after the storm. Opal had seen people pull the red cord beside that door before. She had heard the bell ring when gates jammed, when pipes burst, when humans came running with ropes and soft voices. The cord hung just above her head, swaying lightly in the morning wind. Opal reached for it with her trunk, missed once, then found it. The bell clanged across the yard, sharp and lonely. She pulled again, and again. Each sound scattered the birds from the cottonwoods and rolled across the quiet haven like a warning no one could ignore. Inside, Walt woke with a jolt. For one confused second, he was not in Utah anymore, not in the little cabin with work boots by the bed. He was back under a mountain, hearing metal strike metal in the dark. Then the bell rang again, and the old fear left his chest just long enough for him to sit up. He grabbed his jacket and stepped onto the porch, expecting a broken gate or a loose horse from the neighboring ranch. Instead, he saw Opal. The white calf stood at the bottom step, small against the wide yard, her trunk still lifted toward the bell rope. When she saw him, she did not run away. She stepped closer. Walt froze. Elephant calves did not come alone to human doors before sunrise. They did not stand silent with mud on their knees and stone dust on their faces. Opal's eyes were wet, but not wild. She looked at him with a strange, steady purpose, as if she had searched through the dark and chosen the only person she believed might listen. "Easy, girl," Walt whispered, though his voice sounded rough from sleep and old memories. He came down one step, then another. Opal lifted her trunk and touched the front of his jacket, right over the faded rescue badge he still wore out of habit. Her touch was gentle, but the urgency behind it made his hand tighten around the railing. The yard behind her was quiet, too quiet. No low rumble from Grace, no answering call from the elephant barn. Only wind moving through wet sagebrush and the soft creak of the storm-bent fence near the West Service Road. Walt looked past Opal and noticed the gate light blinking red, warning that power had failed somewhere near the restricted ridge. He reached for the radio clipped beside the door and called for Dr. Claire Dawson. Static answered first, then a broken chirp from the main channel. Opal flinched at the noise, but did not leave. She turned her body toward the back of the property, toward the old mining wash where no calf was ever supposed to go. That was when Walt saw the dust on her trunk. Not ordinary desert dust. This was pale and chalky, caught in the fine wrinkles of her skin. The kind of powder he had seen inside abandoned shafts where limestone rubbed against old timber. His stomach tightened. Opal had not only come from the direction of the ridge. She had been near something underground. He tried to guide her toward the barn, speaking softly, one hand extended and the other reaching for the emergency feed bucket. Opal took 2 steps with him, then stopped. She looked at the water trough beside the porch, lowered her trunk toward it, and pushed the bucket away from herself, sliding it across the wet boards toward the dark road. The motion was clumsy, almost heartbreaking. She was thirsty. Walt could see it in the dry edges of her mouth, in the way her trunk dragged for half a second before lifting again. But she would not drink. She only stared toward the forbidden ridge, then back at Walt, asking him for something larger than comfort. The bell rope still swung behind her, quiet now. Walt looked at it, then at the white calf waiting in the gray light. For the first time that morning, he understood the shape of her fear. Opal had not come to the cabin because she needed saving here. She had come because somewhere beyond the fence, someone else was running out of time. Walt stepped off the porch and into the cold mud. Opal watched him, ears lifting as if hope had weight. When he picked up his flashlight and followed her gaze toward the ridge, she turned and began walking, slow enough for him to follow, fast enough to tell him there was no time to waste. Behind them, the bell gave one final fading ring. Opal moved first, but not far. She crossed the muddy yard with small, careful steps, then stopped near the service road and looked back. The porch light painted her pale body in a weak yellow glow, making the red mud on her legs look darker than it was. Behind her, Walt Bennett stood with a flashlight in one hand and worry already settling into his face. The morning air was cold enough to show his breath, but Opal's sides rose too quickly, too hard. She was tired. Every few seconds her trunk dipped toward the ground, as if it had grown too heavy to hold. Still, she would not turn toward the barn. She kept her whole body pointed toward the forbidden ridge, where the storm clouds had left the rocks black and shining. Dr. Claire Dawson's truck came bouncing across the yard 5 minutes later, headlights sweeping over the fences. She stepped out in a quilted vest, hair pulled back, medical bag already in her hand. Opal flinched at the slam of the door, but she did not run. She only moved closer to Walt, pressing her shoulder lightly against his coat, like she needed him to stay beside her. "Opal," Claire said softly, lowering her voice the way people do around frightened animals. "Sweet girl, what happened to you?" She set a blue bucket of water on the ground and backed away, giving the calf room. Opal stared at the bucket. Her mouth was dry, her trunk trembled over it, and for one long second, Walt thought she might finally drink. But Opal pushed the bucket away. Not hard, not angrily. She nudged it with the end of her trunk until the water sloshed over the rim and ran across the mud toward the ridge road. Then she lifted her head and made a small, broken sound. It was not a cry for herself. It was a sound that seemed to point beyond the fence, beyond the dark barns, beyond the place everyone wanted her to stay. Claire went still. Walt did too. They had both seen thirsty animals before, and Opal was thirsty enough to shake. Yet she stood over the spilled water, as if wasting it hurt her, as if every drop belonged somewhere else. Her eyes followed the thin stream sliding through the mud, and when it vanished into the dirt, she looked back at Walt with something close to panic. Claire checked her quickly, careful not to crowd her. No deep cuts, no broken leg, no obvious bite. But there was chalky dust on her trunk, red clay packed under her nails, and a faint scrape along one side where stone had rubbed her skin raw. Opal endured the touch, but her ears kept turning toward the ridge, listening for something no human could hear. "Her mother's in the south barn," Claire said after calling the night keeper. "Locked in. Safe. She never left her stall." The words should have calmed everyone. Instead, They made the yard feel colder. If Opal had not come for her birth mother, then the question hanging in the air grew heavier. Who was out there in the dark that mattered enough for a calf to cross the storm alone? A golf cart rattled up from the equipment shed, and Maya Torres climbed out with a tablet clutched to her chest. She was young, breathless, her jacket half-zipped and her boots unlaced. "I checked the west fence cameras," she said, trying to steady her voice. "The power flickered all night, but one clip came through. You need to see it." Opal watched the glowing tablet as if she understood it held proof. The footage was grainy, washed in gray rain and lightning. At 4:07 a.m., a pale shape stumbled out from behind a shelf of rock near the old mining wash. Opal appeared through the storm, alone, slipping once in the mud before forcing herself forward toward the haven lights. Nobody spoke for a moment. The video kept playing in silence, showing the little white calf stop beneath the camera and look back into the darkness. She had not wandered. She had escaped. Or worse, she had been sent. Her trunk lifted toward the ridge, and even through the poor footage, the desperation in that small gesture was impossible to miss. Claire reached for the tranquilizer kit, more out of habit than certainty. "If she keeps pushing herself, she may collapse," she said. But the moment Opal saw the syringe case, she backed away, not in fear of Claire, but in refusal. Her feet sank into the mud. Her body swayed. Still, she placed herself between the humans and the ridge road, as if begging them not to waste time, saving only her. Walt lowered himself to one knee in front of her. His old joints protested, but he ignored them. "Not for you," he said quietly, the words more breath than voice. "That water wasn't for you." Opal reached out and touched his sleeve, then turned her head toward the ridge again. This time, she let out a deeper rumble, small but steady, like an answer. Claire closed the medical bag. Maya tucked the tablet under her arm. Walt picked up the flashlight and clipped the radio to his belt. Opal waited until they were ready, then stepped onto the service road with a tired kind of courage that made the adults fall silent. She did not run. She simply led them toward the old mining wash, carrying a fear that no calf should have had to understand. Opal led them away from the cabin and into the gray edge of morning, where the storm had left the whole sanctuary smelling of wet clay and bruised sage. The red cliffs ahead were still half hidden in mist, but she kept her face turned toward them. Her small feet sank into the mud, each step slow, stubborn, and full of a purpose no one could explain. She did not look like an animal trying to escape. She looked like a child trying to remember the way back to a nightmare. Every few yards, she stopped and checked for Walt, Claire, and Maya behind her. When she saw them following, her ears lifted a little, then dropped again, as if hope was too heavy to hold for long. The West Service Road curved past the old hayshed and toward the restricted ridge. Storm water ran in thin brown lines across the tire tracks, carrying leaves, straw, and bits of broken brush. Opal avoided the deeper puddles, not because she feared them, but because she seemed to know where the ground was weakest. Walt noticed that and said nothing. Claire walked behind the calf with her medical bag bouncing against her hip, watching every sway of Opal's body. Maya followed with the tablet pressed to her chest, glancing between the muddy trail and the frozen image from the camera clip. The calf had come from the old mining wash. That much was clear. What nobody knew was why she had survived it alone. They passed the south barn, where the other elephants should have been stirring awake. A keeper named Aaron came out in a raincoat, pale and confused, saying Opal's birth mother was still locked in her stall. She had eaten. She had slept. She had not called once in the night. The news should have brought comfort, but Opal did not even turn her head. At the next gate, the calf stopped. Beyond it stood the quieter enclosure where the older elephants stayed, the ones who moved more slowly and trusted silence more than noise. Opal touched the latch with her trunk, then pressed her forehead to the bars. A low sound came from her chest, so soft that only the people closest to her heard it. Claire's face changed. "Grace," she whispered. The name fell into the mud between them like something fragile. Grace was the old female with one clouded eye, rescued years ago from a traveling show that had left her afraid of crowds and chains. She was not Opal's mother by blood, but when Opal had been rejected as a newborn, Grace had stood beside her and never walked away. Opal pushed through the opened gate before anyone could stop her. Inside Grace's shelter was empty. The hay was scattered, not slept in, but torn apart by restless movement. A gray blanket used for the older elephant's sore joints lay dragged halfway outside, soaked from the rain. Opal touched it with her trunk and froze, as if the smell told her more than any human could. Near the back fence, Walt found the first deep mark in the mud. It was not a footprint. It was a long, heavy scrape, the kind made by a body leaning too hard or being forced through a narrow place. Beside it was an overturned bucket used for warm milk supplements. The white liquid had mixed with rain and run in a pale stream toward the ridge. Opal followed that stream as if it were a trail only she could read. Her steps quickened, then faltered when the ground sloped upward. She was exhausted now. Even her shadow seemed too heavy for her. But when Claire reached for her, Opal moved just out of reach and kept going, carrying Grace's absence ahead of her like a wound. The ridge rose in broken shelves of red stone, cut by old drainage paths and half-buried timber from the mine that had been sealed long before the sanctuary existed. A warning sign leaned crooked in the mud. "Keep out. Unstable ground." Opal stood beneath it, small and pale, then turned toward a narrow gap hidden behind storm-bent rabbit brush. Cold air breathed from the gap. It smelled of wet stone, rust, and something deeper, something trapped. Walt crouched, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The beam caught old wooden braces, slick clay, and a thin thread of moving water. Opal lowered herself to her knees and placed her trunk against the opening. For several seconds, nothing answered. Then a sound rose from below, faint and broken, more felt in the ground than heard in the air. Opal's whole body trembled. Her ears spread, and she made the same low call back into the dark, not loud, not wild, but filled with recognition. Claire covered her mouth with one hand. Maya knelt beside Walt and unfolded the small drone with shaking fingers. Its tiny lights blinked against the dim morning as she guided it into the gap. Opal did not move. She stayed pressed to the earth, listening. On the tablet screen, the image flickered through mud and shadow, then settled on a massive shape lying deep below, breathing but barely. The tablet screen trembled in Maya's hands, its small glow looking too fragile against the wide gray morning. Opal stayed on her knees beside the opening, her trunk pressed to the cold earth. She did not watch the humans. She listened below them, every muscle in her little body pulled toward the darkness, as if her heart had already gone down there. At first, the drone showed only wet stone and old timber. The tunnel walls were slick with clay, and thin lines of water ran through cracks like veins. Then, the camera dipped lower, passing a broken support beam. Walt leaned closer, his face tightening. Claire held her breath. On the screen, a shape moved in the mud, huge and pale beneath the shadows. Grace was alive, but only barely. Her body lay wedged at an angle in a pocket of collapsed earth, one front leg trapped beneath a thick beam. Mud coated her side, and her clouded eye blinked slowly in the drone light. She lifted her trunk a few inches, then let it fall again, too weak to reach the opening above. Opal answered before anyone spoke. A soft rumble rolled out of her chest and into the ground, low and aching. It was not the cry of a lost calf anymore. It was recognition. It was the sound of a child finding the one who had once kept her warm, and realizing that love alone could not lift the weight pressing her down. Claire whispered Grace's name, but then the drone light shifted. Something smaller lay tucked against Grace's belly, almost hidden beneath the fold of her body. Maya zoomed in with shaking fingers. A newborn calf, gray and slick with mud, lay curled under Grace's sheltering side, its ribs moving faintly beneath skin too new for the cold world around it. For a moment, no one moved. Even Walt seemed to forget the rain dripping from his hat brim. Opal did not understand screens or medical words, but she understood the silence. She lifted her head and looked from face to face, searching for the change she had been trying to create since before sunrise. Now they knew. Now they had seen. Claire dropped to her knees beside Opal, her professional calm breaking around the edges. "There's a baby down there," she said, though everyone could see it. "A newborn." Her voice cracked on the word. Grace had not only fallen into the old mine wash, she had spent the night using her own trapped body as a wall between the collapsing tunnel and that tiny life. Opal rose unsteadily, as if the truth had given her strength and taken it away at the same time. She stepped toward the opening, then back toward Walt, then toward the opening again. Her trunk swept the mud in restless circles. She had brought them here. She had done the impossible part for a calf. But now the thing she loved most was still beneath the earth. Walt looked down at her, and the title of the morning seemed to settle over him without being spoken. The white baby elephant had come for help, but not for herself. Not even only for Grace. She had crossed storm water and broken ground to save the old mother who had raised her, and the newborn Grace was still trying to protect. Maya guided the drone closer, careful not to startle Grace. The old elephant's ear twitched once. The newborn made a faint movement, not quite a kick, not quite a breath, and Opal froze at the sight. Then she made a tiny sound, high and broken, the kind of sound that would have vanished in the wind if Walt had not been standing close enough to feel it. Claire checked the sky, and her face changed again. The clouds over the western cliffs were growing darker, rolling low and heavy behind the ridge. Maya opened the weather app on her tablet with one hand while keeping the drone steady with the other. The forecast that had promised a quiet morning was wrong. Another band of rain was moving in fast. "If that tunnel takes more water, it'll flood from below," Maya said. She sounded young then, frightened in a way she had tried not to be. Walt's eyes moved from the opening to the slope above it, reading the land the way he had read mine shafts years ago. The ground was already saturated. One hard downpour could turn the whole chamber into a muddy trap. Opal seemed to sense the new fear before anyone explained it. She pressed herself against the rim of the opening and rumbled again, deeper this time. Far below, Grace answered with a weak vibration that barely reached the surface. The newborn did not move. That absence cut through Opal harder than any sound could have. Walt stood slowly and clipped his flashlight to his belt. Claire started calling the rescue team. Maya kept the drone hovering over Grace like a little star inside the dark, Opal stayed beside the hole, trembling but refusing to step away. She had found them help, but the storm was coming back, and this time, being found might not be enough. The first rescue trucks arrived with their lights off, rolling slowly through the wet red mud, as if the land itself might break under them. Opal heard them before the humans turned their heads. Her ears lifted, then folded back. She did not run toward the noise. She stayed beside the mine opening, guarding the dark, as if Grace and the newborn could disappear if she looked away. Men and women climbed out with ropes, helmets, oxygen tanks, and metal cases that clicked open in the cold morning air. Their voices were low, trained, careful. Opal watched every movement with wide, exhausted eyes. To her, the equipment meant nothing. What mattered was the breathing below, the faint answer from Grace, and the tiny life that had not made a sound. Walt spoke with the rescue captain near the ridge, while Claire explained what the drone had found. Maya kept the camera steady inside the tunnel, her hands stiff from fear. The screen showed Grace's side rising and falling, slower than before. Opal seemed to feel that change. She pressed her trunk into the mud and rumbled softly, begging the darkness to answer. Then another truck came too fast up the service road, splashing muddy water across the warning signs. It was not marked like the others. A man stepped out wearing a clean work jacket and a hard hat with his company name scratched across the front. Tom Kessler looked at the ridge, then at the people gathered there, and the color drained from his face. Opal turned toward him before anyone said his name. Something about his scent, his boots, or the sharp oil smell clinging to his clothes made her go still. She did not trumpet. She did not charge. She only backed closer to Walt, her pale body trembling harder than before, as if this new human carried part of the storm that had swallowed Grace. Tom said the old tunnels had been sealed properly. He said the ground was unstable, too dangerous for anyone to enter. He said a dozen things quickly, each one sounding more polished than the last. But Opal kept staring at him, ears spread low, trunk lifted. Walt saw it. Claire saw it too. The calf was not confused by him. She remembered something. Maya turned the tablet toward Tom, showing the drone image of Grace trapped beneath the beam and the newborn tucked under her body. For the first time, Tom stopped talking. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Opal stepped forward once, slow and unsteady, then touched the wet ground with her trunk, as if pointing to the truth buried beneath his boots. Walt asked about the north drainage outlet. Tom looked away. The rescue captain asked again, sharper this time. Rainwater slid down the red stone behind them and disappeared into cracks no one could see from above. Opal made a small broken sound toward the mine opening, and below Grace answered so faintly it barely reached them. That sound did what questions could not. Tom's shoulders dropped. He admitted his crew had blocked one of the old outlets with filled dirt 2 days before the storm, planning to return with proper supports later. They had been behind schedule. The inspector had not come. The rain had arrived early. Every word fell heavier than the last. Claire's face hardened, but she did not waste anger. Because of that, the water has nowhere to go, she said. Tom nodded once, unable to meet her eyes. Opal did not understand blame, not the way people did. But she understood tone. She understood that the humans had finally found the hidden shape of the danger pressing down on Grace. The rescue captain spread out a faded mine diagram across the hood of a truck. Tom's hands shook as he pointed to a side passage, a forgotten service cut that might reach the chamber without dropping the roof. Walt leaned close, reading the lines like old scars. Maya looked from the map to the drone feed, trying to match paper to darkness. Opal moved between them and the opening, restless and afraid. When Walt stepped away from the map, she touched his sleeve with her trunk, then turned back toward the tunnel. She had brought them proof. She had brought them guilt. Now she needed them to bring Grace back. Her whole small body seemed to ask why knowing the truth was still not enough. The first drops of the second rain began to fall, tapping softly on helmets, truck hoods, and Opal's muddy white back. Tom looked toward the blocked outlet, then down at the map in his hands. Walt's voice was quiet but hard. "If you know the way in, you show us now." Opal stood in the rain beside him, listening for Grace, while the mountain waited. The rain came softly at first, almost politely, dotting Opal's pale back with gray beads that slid through the red mud already dried along her skin. She stood beside the mine opening while the adults moved around her with ropes, helmets, and hard voices. To everyone else, the rescue had begun. To Opal, nothing had changed until Grace answered again. Walt Bennett knelt at the edge of the narrow service cut, one hand on the wet stone, the other resting on the coil of rope clipped to his harness. He had spent years learning how the earth sounded before it failed. Now the ridge seemed to breathe beneath him, slow and uneasy, as if it remembered every tunnel men had carved through its bones. Opal watched him more closely than anyone. She had chosen him before sunrise, pulled him from his cabin with the emergency bell, and led him through mud, fear, and human guilt to this place. Yet now that he was finally going down, her little body shook harder. Bringing help was one thing. Letting it vanish into the dark was another. Claire checked the line around Walt's waist and told him the same instructions twice. Maya stood beside her with the drone feed open, the screen showing Grace below. She still pressed protectively over the newborn. Tom Kessler held the old mine map in both hands, his lips moving silently as he traced a route he should have fixed long before the storm came. For one quiet moment, Walt did not move. Opal saw his shoulders change. The strong, steady man from the porch seemed to fold inward, caught by something no one else could see. He was looking into the tunnel, but his eyes had gone somewhere older, somewhere darker. Rain tapped his helmet like fingers asking him to remember. 12 years earlier, Walt had listened to a man named Ray Miller knock from beneath a collapsed mine shaft. 3 taps, then silence, then 3 taps again. Walt had led the team in, but the mountain shifted before they reached him. Since that day, the sound of trapped life had lived inside Walt like a door he never opened. From below, Grace released a faint rumble. It was weak, almost swallowed by the mud and stone. But Opal felt it. She lifted her trunk and answered, low and trembling. The sound passed through the opening and down into the earth. Walt closed his eyes, and for a second, Ray's knocking and Grace's call seemed to become the same plea. Opal stepped toward him, careful on the slick rock. She reached out and touched his hand with the soft end of her trunk. She did not pull him forward. She did not beg in panic. She only held him there, warm and shaking, as if a baby elephant could remind an old man that this time the trapped were still breathing. Walt opened his eyes. Something in his face settled, not into bravery exactly, but into choice. He placed his rough hand against Opal's trunk and whispered, "This time we go slow." Opal did not understand the words, but she understood the calm behind them. Her ears lifted just a little, and the rain seemed to quiet around them. He lowered himself into the service cut, boots scraping wet stone, flashlight beams slicing through the narrow black. The rope tightened, and the humans above leaned back together. Opal moved to the edge, but Claire gently blocked her with one arm. The calf did not fight. She pressed her trunk to the ground and listened to Walt descend. Maya guided the drone ahead of him, its tiny light floating in the dark like a firefly that had lost the sky. On the screen, Walt appeared small against the old timber braces and clay walls. Tom called out directions, his voice cracking whenever the map showed a weak support. Every step Walt took seemed to draw the whole ridge into silence. Then Walt saw Grace with his own eyes. She was larger than the screen had made her, and more fragile than any elephant should have looked. One leg was trapped beneath a beam, her side heaving against the mud. Beneath her, the newborn lay curled close, barely moving. Walt's hand went still on the flashlight. Above ground, Opal felt the pause. She did not need the screen to know he had reached them. Her whole body leaned toward the opening, her trunk flattened against the cold rim. She rumbled again, stronger this time, sending her small voice down into the mine. Grace's ear twitched. The newborn's side lifted once, shallow but real. Walt moved toward the beam and set his tools in the mud. The old timber groaned when he touched it, and dust sifted down from the roof in a thin, deadly curtain. Maya gasped at the screen. Tom shouted for him to stop. Then another sound cut through them all. Water, running faster inside the wall. The second storm had found the tunnel. The sound of water changed everything. At first, it was only a thin rush somewhere inside the stone, a hidden stream waking after the rain. Then it grew louder, spreading through the old mine like breath turning into panic. Above the opening, Opal lifted her head. She did not understand tunnels, beams, or maps, but she knew the dark had begun to move. Below her, Walt's voice crackled over the radio, calm only because he was forcing it to be. He said water was coming through the wall behind Grace. Maya stared at the drone feed, her face washed pale by the tablet light. Claire gave orders with a steady voice, but Opal heard the fear underneath. Humans always smelled different when hope started slipping. Opal pressed closer to the rim, her small feet sliding in the mud. Claire tried to guide her back, but the calf would not leave the opening. Down there was Grace, the old mother who had once warmed her when the rest of the world felt cold. Down there was the newborn, silent beneath Grace's side. Opal could not see them, but every part of her body reached for them. Rain began falling harder, striking the ridge in silver lines. It ran over Opal's back and turned the red dust on her skin into thin streams. She shook once, then stood still again. Her ears moved toward every sound. The ropes tightening, the rescue captain calling measurements, Tom shouting directions, Walt breathing inside the tunnel where the earth was beginning to complain. Tom Kessler ran toward his construction truck with the old mine map clutched in one hand. For a second, Opal watched him with the same wary stillness she had shown before. This man's choices had helped trap Grace, yet now he moved like someone trying to outrun his own shame. He climbed into the loader, started the engine, and drove toward the blocked drainage cut. The machine roared against the storm, its bucket slamming into wet-packed earth. Mud burst outward in heavy chunks. Men shouted for Tom to slow down, but he kept digging where the map told him the old outlet had been buried. Opal flinched at every crash, but she did not run. She only answered Grace again, sending a low, trembling call through the rain. Inside the tunnel, Walt knelt in rising water beside the trapped elephant. It climbed around his boots, dark and cold, swirling with clay. Grace tried to shift when she heard Opal, but the beam held her leg like a cruel hand. The newborn's tiny body lay pressed under her, barely moving. Walt touched Grace's shoulder and told her to hold on, though time was thinning fast. The loader hit stone, then old timber. The whole ridge shuddered. Opal stumbled sideways, and Maya grabbed the fence post, nearly dropping the tablet. A crack opened in the mud near the service cut, and for one terrible moment, everyone froze. If the wrong part of the ground gave way, the tunnel would bury Walt, Grace, and the calf below before anyone could reach them. Then the buried outlet broke open. Water blasted through the new channel, carrying mud, sticks, and years of hidden pressure with it. Tom's machine lurched hard as the ground gave under one tire. The loader tilted, metal screaming. Men rushed toward him, but Tom waved them away and kept the bucket down until the flood shifted away from the chamber. The rush inside the tunnel weakened, but Grace still could not rise. Walt's voice came through strained and breathless. "She has to stand, even a few inches." Claire looked down at Opal then, really looked at her. The calf was shaking so badly her knees bent, but her eyes stayed fixed on the opening. Claire whispered, "She's listening to you, baby." Walt asked for silence. One by one, the engines cut. The shouting stopped. Even Tom's loader fell quiet, ticking in the rain like a tired animal. The whole ridge seemed to hold its breath. Opal stood alone at the edge of the mine, small and soaked, with every human waiting behind her. For the first time, no one tried to lead her. They let her lead. She lowered her trunk into the cold gap and made the sound Grace had used when Opal was new and unwanted. A low, rolling lullaby that had once meant safety, milk, shade, and sleep. It was not loud, but it was full. It carried through stone and water, through fear and mud, down to the old elephant who had never left hers when she was small. Far below, Grace answered. The sound came back broken, but alive. Opal called again, longer this time, her whole body trembling with the effort. On the drone feed, Grace's ear lifted, her shoulder pressed into the mud. Walt braced himself against her side as the trapped leg shifted. The beam groaned, but Grace did not stop. With a strength that seemed to come from somewhere older than pain, Grace rose just enough for the weight to change. Walt shouted that she was moving. The ropes tightened. Claire covered her mouth. Maya began to cry without looking away from the screen. Opal stayed at the opening, still calling into the dark, while below her, the first impossible space opened for rescue. The first thing they brought out of the mine was not Grace. It was the newborn. A rescuer emerged from the service cut with the tiny gray calf wrapped in a muddy thermal blanket, its body so still that even the rain seemed to fall more quietly around it. Opal took one step forward, then stopped, as if she knew this moment was too fragile to touch. Claire dropped beside the calf before anyone could speak. Her hands moved quickly, clearing mud from the little trunk, rubbing the narrow chest, warming the limp body with towels pulled from a medical case. Opal watched every motion, ears held wide, rain dripping from the tips. She had brought them here, but now she could do nothing except stand and hope. The newborn did not cry. That silence was worse than any scream. Walt climbed from the mine covered in mud up to his chest, breathing hard, his hands shaking from the cold water below. He looked at Opal first, then at the small life on the blanket. For a few terrible seconds, the whole ridge seemed to wait between one breath and the next. Claire pressed 2 fingers near the calf's jaw and lowered her face close to the tiny trunk. "Come on," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You made it this far," Opal answered with a trembling rumble, so soft it barely rose above the rain. The newborn's ear twitched. Then its little trunk curled, weak and uncertain, and a thin breath slipped into the morning. The sound broke something open in everyone, Maya covered her mouth and cried. One rescuer turned away, wiping his eyes with the back of his glove. Opal lifted her trunk toward the sky and released a low, uneven call that sounded too old for her small body. It was not joy alone. It was relief after carrying fear farther than any calf should have had to carry it. Grace came next. It took ropes, braces, quiet commands, and the careful patience of people afraid of hurting what they were trying to save. When her great head appeared from the service cut, Opal leaned forward so hard, Claire had to steady her. Mud slid from Grace's face, and her one clear eye searched the ridge until it found the white calf waiting in the rain. Grace stumbled when they guided her onto solid ground. Her trapped leg shook beneath her, but it held long enough for her to turn toward Opal. The calf went to her then, not running, not bursting with excitement, but slowly, reverently, as if crossing the space between life and loss. Grace lowered her trunk and touched Opal's forehead. No one spoke. The old elephant's touch said enough. It said she remembered the abandoned white calf she had once sheltered. It said she knew who had gone into the storm for help. It said family was not always the one who gave birth to you. Sometimes family was the one who stayed, and sometimes it was the one who came back. The newborn, later named Hope, survived the first hour, then the second. By afternoon, the rain stopped, and a pale strip of sunlight opened over the cliffs. Opal stood outside the recovery pen, while Grace rested under blankets and IV lines, with Hope tucked safely near her side. Each time Hope breathed, Opal's ears moved, counting the sound like a promise. In the weeks that followed, Cedar Ridge grew quiet again, but not the same. Tom Kessler admitted everything to the county and lost the contract he had tried so hard to protect. Maya became the person everyone called before entering old ground. Walt came to the recovery barn every evening, pretending to check pipes, though Opal always knew he had come to see them. Grace healed slowly. Hope learned to stand on legs that looked too thin for the world. Opal never pushed her way between them. She stayed close enough to guard, far enough to let the new calf learn Grace's warmth for herself. Sometimes Walt found Opal beside the fence at dusk, watching Hope sleep, her white body glowing softly in the last red light. Months later, when Grace and Hope were strong enough, the sanctuary opened a new pasture beyond the ridge, far from the old mine. Walt stood by the gate with his weathered rescue tag in his hand. It was the tag he had worn since the day he lost Ray Miller, the day he believed some calls for help arrived too late. He hung it on the gate latch and whispered, "This time, we made it." Opal walked to him before following Grace into the grass. She lifted her trunk and placed it gently against his chest, right where the old tag had always rested. Walt laid his hand over her trunk and closed his eyes. He did not feel forgiven by the past. Not exactly. But for the first time in years, the past did not feel like it owned him. The final surprise came on a quiet morning long after the rescue. Walt heard the emergency bell ring once outside his cabin, and his heart jumped the way it had before sunrise months ago. He rushed to the porch, expecting fear, mud, and another desperate call. Instead, Opal stood in the soft light with Grace behind her, and Hope pressed close to Grace's leg. At Opal's feet lay a small branch of desert flowers, damp with dew, the kind Grace used to pull from the pasture and offer her when she was little. Opal did not ring the bell again. She only looked at Walt, calm and steady. This time, the bell was not asking for help. It was saying they remembered. And in that quiet, Walt finally understood that kindness does not end when the danger does. If this story touched your heart, leave a simple comment below. Comment 1 if you believe Opal came for help because love remembers. Comment 0 if you believe Walt was saved just as much as Grace and Hope were. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest courage. And sometimes kindness comes back in ways we never expect. If you enjoy stories about animals, compassion, second chances, and the quiet bonds that change people forever, please subscribe to the channel and stay with us. More emotional journeys are coming, and the next one may stay in your heart even longer.